we've lived on this planet, going to sea has brought challenge, excitement, adventure.
I am a sailor, and these are the ships of the United States Navy at sea. Our ships are many things to us and to the nation we serve. These are cities on the move. These are places of work, arsenals of destruction. These are schools and homes to us for months at a time. Going to sea, it's been a place of serving and of sacrifice for millions of us. The sailors of the United States Navy, on a journey.
General quarters, all hands back at battle station.
This is part of the journey. Recruits being pushed to perform.
I want everybody else on back in 1 minute. Let's go.
These young men and women are becoming the newest members of the United States Navy. They've come here to the shores of Lake Michigan, along with more than 50,000 others each year, to grow, to learn, and to prepare to serve. Navy recruits. A cross-section of our country. In educational achievement, in ethnic, racial, and gender diversity.
They may not know it yet, but soon they will become a part of our history, our heritage.
It's the United States Navy and a new century. Over 370,000 men and women using knowledge, skill, and experience to ensure that our Navy can serve the needs of our nation.
Our Navy defends the United States through threat of force or its actual use. Our Navy promotes America's ideals, global peace and stability, 24 hours a day, working with technology, using our intelligence, and standing for the ideals of honor, courage, commitment. We are the proud sailors of the United States Navy, and this is our story. Our Navy story begins in the 1770s with the struggle of American colonists to end British domination. Our Navy's birth date? October 13th, 1775, when the Continental Congress votes to purchase and arm 2 vessels to support the rebellion.
On July 4th, 1776, we formally declared our independence from Great Britain. The American Revolution had officially begun. To support the war, Congress had already authorized procurement of 13 new frigates and other vessels. The Continental Navy was not intended to seek engagements with British warships, but to protect our own supply ships and to capture those carrying provisions to the British.
To lure the British Navy away from our American coast, we strike, far across the Atlantic, off the coast of England, and pull off an impressive victory. The crew of our frigate, Bonhomme Richard, commanded by John Paul Jones, eventually captures the much more powerful British warship Serapis in a fierce battle continuing far into the night. Our ship is close to sinking when the British captain asks if Jones is ready to surrender. "I have not yet begun to fight," Jones shouts back, and we fight on to victory.
After 5 years of setbacks as well as successes, our independence was won at Yorktown, Virginia, in October 1781. Combined American and French naval and land forces cut off Lord Cornwallis's army. British troops surrendered to General Washington. We would soon become the United States of America. Merchant ships of the new United States began showing the stars and stripes on the seas around the globe.
But when our Yankee merchant vessels sail to the Mediterranean, we are easy targets for the ruthless corsairs of North Africa. They capture our ships and hold our crews and passengers for unbelievable ransom demands.
President George Washington and Congress were outraged. And to stop the attacks, they authorized the construction of 6 vast frigates. The first to be built, the United States, the Constellation, and the Constitution. These new American ships were the most powerful of their class in the world. We soon dispatched several expeditions to deal with the corsairs. And one operation is legendary. It was after the corsairs captured our frigate Philadelphia. Young U.S. Navy Lieutenant Stephen Decatur and a party of 80 volunteer sailors and Marines undertook a daring mission to prevent Philadelphia from being used by the enemy. At night, they disguised their boat and themselves as local traders and stealthily slipped into the enemy harbor. With the odds against them, they attacked and overpowered the corsairs. They set the Philadelphia ablaze, and they escaped without losing a man. These victories of the new United States Navy were the result of the bravery, dedication, and the sailing and fighting skills of our American sailors.
Most of our sailors are young. They are all volunteers, and they spend a lot of time practicing sailing, gunnery, and other skills. To make or take in sail, top men scramble aloft in every kind of weather, edging out onto yardarms 100 feet or more above the deck. Lying across the yard, they use one hand to reach for lines that hold a sail furled to its spar, or to gather in salt-stiffened canvas, while hanging on for their life with the other hand. Others handle the halyards and braces that trim the sails. At the time of battle, sailors are assigned to gun crews in the most difficult and incredibly dangerous life and death tasks.
In the early years of the 1800s, the British were stopping our merchant ships at sea. They were seizing our cargoes and forcing our sailors into service on British naval vessels. 3 decades after the Revolution, we were again at war with Britain, fighting for free trade and the rights of sailors. In that war of 1812, the powerful British Navy had our Navy both outnumbered and outgunned. But the superior seamanship and gunnery of American sailors gave the Navy, and especially the Constitution, important victories over the British, and an end to the war in 1815. Constitution's wooden sides had proved so strong that enemy cannon shot literally bounced off, and her crew and the nation gave her the name Old Ironsides. It's the name she retains to this day.
We were the sailors of a new and proudly independent United States of America. But many of our ways of doing things, and much of our language of sailing and fighting, had come from the British Navy. We learned words we'd be using more than 200 years later, like quarterdeck, blue jacket, scuttlebutt, bosun's mate, yeoman, quartermaster, berthing. Sailor life in those years of sail was not the best. Most of us had been pulled right off the street at harbors all over the world, recruited for one cruise at a time. Aboard ship, we slept and ate in cramped, dark, and almost airless quarters, next to cannons we'd one day be firing and maybe dying beside. We were punished by floggings for any kind of offense. We liked our daily ration of rum, but there were diseases. The food was pretty bad, and we'd usually be at sea for more than a year. What the Navy needed most from us was our muscle and courage. But in the future, a lot of that would change. We'd have more of a chance to use our brains as well as our brawn.
For our Navy and sailors, the next 45 years was a time of technological change. Ship propulsion by the power of the wind began to yield to the recently invented steam engine and the power of the paddle wheel.
These new steamships, first propelled by paddle wheels and then by more efficient screw propellers, also carry full sets of sail. Both merchant and naval ships need two kinds of crews, one to handle hemp lines and canvas, the other to fire boilers and operate and repair the steam engines.
For the Navy, those were years of worldwide diplomatic missions to promote American trade interests in new and distant ports of call. Across the Pacific, Commodore Matthew Perry and his sailors helped open Japan to Western influence. And during those same years, the Navy was also at work exploring and charting the world's oceans. Back home, by the mid-1800s, issues of plantation slavery and states' rights in the South were at odds with the more industrial North and its opposition to slavery and its belief in strong federal government. By the end of 1861, 11 southern states had rebelled and seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. President Abraham Lincoln and the northern states resolved to forcibly preserve the Union. The Civil War was upon us. Brother against brother, American against American.
Our job as the Union Navy is to capture or blockade southern ports to prevent the Confederates from shipping and selling cotton to Europe and from bringing back war supplies. We have to blockade the 3,500 miles of coast running all the way from the Potomac River to the Rio Grande. The duty seems endless, boring, and the heat unbearable. At first, Southern ships easily run through the blockade. But as the war continues, our Union patrols become much more effective. The South works to develop inventions to break the blockade, like mining their harbors and launching their submarine, the H.L. Hunley. And the South is also the first to complete and to launch a steam-powered ironclad. The Confederate ironclad Virginia. It was built on the hull of the captured Union steam frigate Merrimac. Virginia actually destroys 2 Union blockaders, but is soon faced by the Union-built ironclad Monitor. It is the first battle in the world between 2 ironclads. Although the Monitor's revolving turret ends the need to maneuver for broadside attack, the battle is actually a standoff. But it gives us a look at the future of materials, technologies, and tactics of a whole new age in naval warfare, and the work of sailors.
The Union Navy was now a force of 600 ships. And while the South was being confined by the blockade, Union sailors attacked and overcame defending forces at both New Orleans and at Mobile Bay. Out on the Mississippi, Missouri, Tennessee, and Ohio rivers, the Navy supported the Union Army with flotillas of river gunboats. Combined Army-Navy operations took many important Confederate strongpoints. The Civil War would end in 1865 with Union victory. The Civil War claimed more American lives than any war we would ever fight. But it preserved the nation and ended slavery forever. After the Civil War, Americans worked at reunifying our country. We were impatient to settle the West and to develop the potential of our nation from coast to coast. During those years, our overseas trade and our merchant fleet actually declined. With fewer ships to protect and with no enemy facing us, our Navy also fell into decline.
But finally, almost 20 years after the Civil War, a tide turns in favor of a modern American Navy. In 1883, Congress authorizes the construction of our Navy's first steel-hulled and armor-protected cruisers. Atlanta, Boston, and Chicago. These ships are still fitted with full sets of sail because coal isn't always available on many sea routes. But this new look of our Navy isn't just a new look in ship design. We are recruiting sailors with much more of the skills to operate and maintain the most complex and powerful steamships. We also have new, more accurate, and powerful guns to master and maintain, as well as ship-launched torpedoes.
The strategy of sea power for changing our Navy into a significant modern fighting force was being provided by the brilliant naval thinker and teacher, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan. As a result, the Navy began building our first real battleships in the early 1890s. Our increasing preparedness would soon pay off. In the late 1890s, a crisis long brewing in Cuba, only 90 miles from Florida, came to a boil as the Cubans rebelled against Spanish colonial rule. Our battleship Maine was sent to Havana Harbor to protect American lives and property. On the night of February 15th, 1898, the Maine exploded and sank. 226 sailors died in the blast. The American press and many American citizens suspected Spain had mined the ship. When diplomacy failed to win Cuban independence, the United States declared war on Spain. The Spanish-American War.
Our strategy is to quickly assemble our fleet to confront and defeat the Spanish Navy in the Caribbean. To join the Atlantic Fleet, the crew of the Oregon has to steam 13,000 miles from the west coast, down around the tip of South America, and up to the Caribbean. A 66-day voyage. Out across the Pacific, our squadron, under Admiral George Dewey, steams to the Philippine Islands, and we destroy the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay.
And 2 months later, in waters off Santiago, Cuba, American ships defeated the entire Spanish squadron in the Caribbean. The United States Navy and our sailors emerged from the Spanish-American War in great public favor. More and bigger battleships were laid down. Our first submarines and destroyers were added to the fleet. New bases were established. And in 1902, the Navy League of the United States was founded as a civilian organization to educate the public about the need for a strong Navy.
In the early years of the 20th century, the Navy is taking steps to make life better for Blue Jackets. Join the Navy and see the world becomes the Navy's recruiting slogan. And in 1907 through 1909, the world sees our Navy. President Theodore Roosevelt dispatches our Great White Fleet on a prestige-building around-the-world cruise. It's important training for all of us in major fleet operations. During these same years, an unusual new technology is attracting Navy attention. It's the airplane. In 1911, a Navy-contracted pilot, Eugene Ely, both lands and takes off from wooden platforms installed on warships. It makes us wonder what this might mean for the future. From the middle of the 1800s to the early 1900s, there were enormous changes in the Navy. The Navy was improving recruiting and training, and we were feeling greater respect for our knowledge and judgment. The steam engines, the steel ships, electricity, and the wireless telegraph. The fact that sailors would have to be American citizens, recruited from all parts of our country. This was an important time for us. In 75 years, we'd moved from sails and wood to steam power and steel. Conditions were better for us. Flogging was long gone, and so was the rum ration. We had many new ratings to handle the complexity of our ships. Engineering was to be a permanent part of our lives. And loading coal was still a part of it too. An all-hands operation that ran day and night until a ship's bunkers were filled. It was the dirty side of our Navy's readiness as a world power.
Ominous international developments were unfolding in Europe. Two alliance systems, each hostile to the other, were engaged in an arms race and were preparing for war. In 1914, World War I was tragically underway, with Germany and the Central Powers on one side and Great Britain, France, and Russia on the other. Unable to defeat the French and British armies, the Germans tried to starve England into submission by sinking the ships delivering the island nation its urgently needed food, supplies, and munitions. Then, a German submarine torpedoed the British passenger ship Lusitania without warning. Nearly 1,200 passengers and crew were killed, including 128 Americans. After U-boat attacks on American merchant ships, the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917.
Our job is to combat the U-boat threat and get our troops and supply convoys across the North Atlantic safely. And we do it. Over 2 million Army and Marine Corps troops and their equipment arrive in France without the loss of a ship or man-to-enemy action. World War I finally ends on November 11th, 1918. We still celebrate that day. We call it Veterans Day. In those years after World War I, our Navy tries to maintain a fighting edge, despite huge cutbacks in funding and severe international treaty limits on the size of the world's navies. But aviation isn't limited by treaties. In 1919, our Navy flying boat, NC-4, is the first airplane to cross the Atlantic. Soon, a new kind of ship, the aircraft carrier, joins the fleet, along with new tactics and jobs for sailors and flight crews. New long-range missions for our fleet submarines are also developing.
But looming in the 1930s were serious international threats. Japan moved to dominate Asia and the Pacific. In Europe, Italy's fascist dictator Mussolini was bent on recreating the Roman Empire. And Germany, led by Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler, moved to conquer all of Europe. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Poland's allies, Britain and France, declared war on Germany. Soon the Italians joined on the German side. Nazi legions overran Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, eventually conquering most of Europe. Britain was the only major European power left to face the German onslaught. The United States committed major resources to support the British and rapidly began rebuilding our depleted Navy and other armed forces. At the same time, we deployed the Pacific Fleet from our west coast to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii to discourage Japanese aggression.
But it doesn't work. On the quiet Sunday morning of December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. Nearly 400 Japanese carrier-launched aircraft descend on our American fleet. The Japanese sink 10 of our ships, including our battleships Arizona, Oklahoma, California, and West Virginia. Over 3,000 of our sailors are killed or wounded. 265 American aircraft destroyed. We are at war in the Pacific.
Then, Hitler declared war on the United States, only a few days after Pearl Harbor. And for the next several months, German U-boats operating right off our American East Coast sank scores of helpless merchant freighters and tankers. Facing war in two hemispheres, it was a difficult time for our nation and our Navy. Japan overran Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. But U.S. carrier aircraft were able to halt the Japanese advance on Australia in the Battle of Coral Sea.
Coral Sea is the first naval engagement in history where neither fleet has direct visual contact with the other. Planes from opposing carriers deliver the attack. Both fleets are damaged, but neither side can call it victory. Four weeks later, starting June 4th, 1942, and lasting 2 days, the Battle of Midway will be the most decisive naval engagement of the Pacific War.
General quarters, all hands man your battle stations, all hands man your battle stations.
A lot is at stake. Japan wants to finish what it started at Pearl Harbor and take complete control of the Pacific. Though Japan has more aircraft and a huge battle force, what we have is crucial. We know the Japanese fleet is on its way. Our Navy code breakers had deciphered secret Japanese radio transmissions. Pacific Fleet Commander Chester Nimitz decides to strike the first blow. We find the Japanese in the middle of the Pacific, steaming east to take our vital airbase at tiny Midway Island. We have no battleships against their 9. Only 8 cruisers against their 15. 3 carriers against their 4. But lying in wait, undetected, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown offer our only hope against overwhelming odds. The timing of our surprise is crucial. Our ambush on the attacking Japanese begins. In attack after attack, our torpedo planes face brutal enemy anti-aircraft fire. None of the torpedoes are effective. Most of these pilots never return. But our dive bombers press on with incredible courage and flying skill. Within 24 hours, we sink all 4 large Japanese carriers and destroy hundreds of Japanese aircraft. Even though we do lose our carrier Yorktown, the Battle of Midway ends the Japanese threat to Hawaii and the American West Coast, and gives us time.
It gave us time to prepare for our Allied counteroffensive to defeat the Japanese. Our Pacific and Atlantic offensives were enormous undertakings, requiring all the ships, aircraft, tanks, equipment, and supplies American industry could produce.
In the Atlantic, we have to end the Nazi U-boat threat. We've started using newly developed electronic sensing and communication equipment on our ships and in the skies above. And we continue refining our code breaking ashore. Our convoys of men and material now have a chance to reach Europe. American and Allied navies are transporting millions of troops and their equipment to the Mediterranean, to land in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. And then, the biggest landing of all, D-Day. Our Allied invasion of the Normandy coast of France, the 6th of June, 1944. 176,000 American, British, and Canadian troops. The tanks, guns, and supplies for our Allied invasion to retake Europe from the Germans.
During these same months, our ally, the Soviet Union, was battling Germany on the Eastern European front. Less than a year after D-Day, massive Allied attacks from the air and on the ground forced the Germans to surrender.
In the Pacific, since 1942, we've been launching air and ground forces against Japanese-held island chains on our way to attack Japan itself. We learned names like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and later Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. It takes enormous effort, cost, and courage. From island to island, we repeat a pattern. Drive the enemy fleet from surrounding waters through carrier aircraft, surface ship, and submarine attack. Bombard enemy positions on shore. Crucial preparation for amphibious assaults. Hundreds of assaults. Thousands of casualties. Navy corpsmen have their hands full. We have to take these islands as staging bases for air attacks and naval attacks on the next islands and the next. Iwo Jima, Okinawa. And from our new carriers, faster and more powerful aircraft join with our Pacific submarine fleet to become decisive weapons against Japan's retreating warships and its dwindling merchant fleet.
Finally, U.S. Army Air Force B-29s, flying from islands seized by Navy, Marine, and Army amphibious forces, dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945.
A month later, on the deck of our battleship Missouri, Japan surrenders. The Second World War is over. From those years at the start of World War I, all the way to the end of World War II, we had become the most powerful and advanced naval force in the world. Much, of course, would still lie ahead. But we'd answered our nation's call. We were better trained in the skills and specialties needed for victory. Great Lakes had been established for our World War I training. We'd been recruited by the thousands. And our ranks included women in nursing and important onshore duties. By World War II, there were millions of us. And everything we were learning was a matter of life and death. War raged, and we were working together, committed to victory.
No sooner was World War II over than our victorious alliance began to fall apart. The Soviet dictator, Joseph Stalin, refused to remove his occupying armies from nations they had freed from the German forces. Stalin brutally suppressed political, religious, and economic freedoms in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, and fostered the spread of communist revolutionary ideology around the world. The development of two antagonistic power blocks, led on the one side by the Soviet Union and on the other by the United States, resulted in what would soon be known as the Cold War. To resist and contain communism, the United States deployed strong military forces along the perimeter of the communist world.
Our ability to continuously patrol every area and depth of the sea is a critical need. One answer is nuclear propulsion, championed by our brilliant and controversial Admiral Hyman G. Rickover. Our first nuclear-powered submarine goes to sea in 1954. The crew of the Nautilus impresses the world with America's technological superiority. And soon, our nuclear-powered surface ships are also seen at sea and in ports all around the world. As the Cold War continues, the nuclear submarine is the most important deterrent to possible Soviet attack on the United States. These nearly invulnerable submarines are armed with increasingly powerful long-range, nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles.
The Cold War was not only a standoff of nuclear-armed nations and their allies. It showed itself in other ways as well. Korea, June 1950. A hot war within the Cold War. Communist North Korea attacked the Democratic Republic of Korea to its south. The United Nations resolved to repel the invasion and preserve a young Asian democracy.
Navy and Marine forces turned the tide during the first year of the war with a daring amphibious assault at Incheon. Flying jets in combat for the first time, our Navy and Marine pilots hit enemy bases and transportation routes. Our battleships, cruisers, and destroyers provide gunfire support for UN troops in the field. For 3 years, we maintain control of the sea and keep up the flow of supplies and reinforcements to the battlefield. In 1953, Korea ends in stalemate.
Then, Berlin, Germany, a continuing Cold War drama. In 1961, the repressive communist East Germans constructed an ominous wall to keep their people from the freedoms of West Berlin. And there was Cuba, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It resulted from the Soviet Union's mistaken belief that they could place nuclear-capable missiles and bombers on the island of Cuba, only 90 miles from our shores.
President John F. Kennedy orders us to quarantine Cuba to prevent Soviet ships from delivering any more offensive weapons. Kennedy tells the Russians to immediately remove the missiles and aircraft already in Cuba. Monitored by our Navy patrol aircraft, surface ships, and under the threat of a strategic response, the Soviets withdraw the offending weapons from Cuba.
And then, another hot war within the Cold War, Vietnam. With the outbreak of major hostilities in 1964, 7th Fleet carrier aircraft and surface combatants, like Battleship New Jersey, bombed and shelled enemy targets in North and South Vietnam.
We land Marines on contested beaches. Our hospital corpsmen and nurses care for wounded onshore and offshore. We keep 500,000 U.S. and Allied troops supplied from the United States across the Pacific. Navy carrier strikes and mining of North Vietnam's major ports continue. We are patrolling coastal and river waters for enemy arms and supplies. And we are teaming with Marine and Army troops to go after Viet Cong guerrillas and the North Vietnamese on hundreds of missions, wherever it takes us.
Following the end of that war and our withdrawal from Vietnam, the United States faced a new threat: the rise of the Soviet Navy. Soviet warships, submarines, and aircraft seriously challenged our control of the sea. But with the buildup of our fleet to almost 600 ships, the Navy asserted a new and powerful presence. The Soviets simply could not match our technological superiority. The arms race with the United States so drained the Soviet Union's economy that they faced virtual economic collapse. In 1989, the world watched the destruction of the Berlin Wall. The end of the Cold War was at hand. And then, in August 1990, armed conflict flared in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein's Iraqi armed forces attacked and conquered the Persian Gulf Sheikhdom of Kuwait and threatened to invade Saudi Arabia next door.
In mid-January 1991, our naval forces joined our UN coalition partners in Operation Desert Storm to force the Iraqis out of Kuwait and limit Saddam's ability to threaten his neighbors. Our carrier and shore-based naval aircraft and our ship and submarine-launched Tomahawk land attack missiles strike targets throughout Iraq and Kuwait. At the same time, our battle force in the Persian Gulf destroys the Iraqi Navy. We shell targets ashore with our battleships Missouri and Wisconsin. Despite damage to 2 U.S. warships from mines, the fleet is able to move close to the coast of Kuwait. We threaten an amphibious landing, which keeps enemy attention focused toward the sea, as coalition ground forces, including American Marines and soldiers, overwhelm and defeat the Iraqi army on its desert flanks.
The Gulf War was over. Though the war was over, our carrier and surface forces would remain deployed long after Desert Storm to ensure Iraqi compliance with United Nations mandates. It's but one of the continuing global responsibilities of the United States and its Navy. For example, the Bosnia and Kosovo crises in the late 1990s required significant Navy response. Since the end of World War II, the United States Navy has been involved in dealing with over 200 international incidents. Chaos in the form of ethnic, civil, and religious strife seems to be unending. Terrorism is a constant threat. The world remains a dangerous place.
In our Navy, the years since World War II have brought remarkable changes. Our work as sailors has steadily become more complex and always changing. With new electronic sensing and communications, we can reach any place on Earth. Computers are now involved in every aspect of our work and life as sailors. Since World War II, the women of our Navy have taken on increasing responsibilities and authority in a continually growing range of jobs. These years have also seen our petty officers become more relied upon and admired than at any point in Navy history. And since 1967, a Master Chief has represented us at the very highest level of Navy leadership as the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy. Today, what we must learn and know as sailors, more than ever, means meeting the challenges of the future.
The United States is a nation that is vital to the preservation of human rights and international stability in the modern world. And the men and women of the United States Navy are in the service of this cause.
Since 1775, each sailor, whether we are reporting for our first voyage of service or shipping over for another enlistment, we carry within ourselves a unique and shared experience.
Permission on board, sir. Permission granted. Welcome aboard.
Request permission to come aboard, sir.
Permission granted. Welcome aboard.
Today, as in the past, each one of us stands for our proud Navy heritage.
Permission granted. Welcome aboard.
Learning a lot is a part of being a sailor. We're going to be departing in about 2 hours.
Ours is an important story, and it's a story that's still unfolding.
Learn a lot in the next 6 months, and we're going to be happy that you came aboard the ship. I'll take you down to your workstations now and show you how to check in. I'm giving you a lot of information for the last 20 or 30 minutes. That's just a part of being a sailor.
Left full rudder.
Left full rudder aye.
Starboard engine ahead 1/3. Port engine back 1/3.
Starboard engine ahead 1/3. Port engine's back 1/3 aye. Rudder's left full, no order course given.
Very well.
Each of us represents in many ways the values known to us all as honor, courage, and commitment. They are values forged from a heritage of more than 200 years of serving our country at sea. We are the sailors of the United States Navy, and this is our story.